The following stories are from members of Hanmaum Church in South Korea. They aired on a Korean Christian TV network called C Channel and were dubbed in English. Hello, I'm Min-Kyeong Kang from Hanmaum Church in Chuncheon. Luggage bags, airports, living overseas. Just hearing words like that used to make my heart pound with excitement. I was someone who loved the idea of going abroad. I hated living in a small, stuffy place like Korea, so I planned to live in a bigger, more prosperous country overseas. Then I met the risen Jesus and became someone who prepares for an eternal life in heaven. I'd like to share this testimony with you. When I was young, our dad always told my brother and me to dream big, because by the time we were adults, we'd be able to travel across the whole world. That was why I started learning English ever since I was a little girl. But as a university student, I was discouraged because so many of my classmates had lived overseas for a long time. And they spoke English so well, they would just take over the class. I used to feel confident in my English abilities because I used to win a lot of awards in English competitions when I was in high school. But in front of these kids, I felt inferior. Not only did they speak great English, but they had also picked up sensible and sophisticated cultural habits of the West. Seeing my classmates, I made up my mind to study abroad no matter what. But around that time, my father's business failed and studying abroad became an impossible dream. That's why I got my first job even before I graduated, and after saving up for a year, I finally got to go to Australia. That was when I seriously began to dream of living abroad. Staying in Australia for 6 months opened my eyes to a whole new world. I went to parties with friends from many different countries, and I even dressed up and traveled on luxurious dinner cruises. Because I was having all kinds of experiences that I couldn't have in Korea, I felt like the quality of my life had gotten better. Plus, my host family's house really won my heart over. It was a beautiful two-story house with a swimming pool. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. And it had 6 rooms. I heard that it only cost 1 to 200,000 US dollars to build a house like that at the time. With that amount of money, you could barely afford to lease a 2-bedroom apartment in Seoul. Australia seemed like a paradise. I was so envious of the people living there, raising their kids and their dogs and tending to their backyards on the weekends in houses like that. One day I was visiting a friend who had Australian roommates, and they would enjoy luxurious hobbies like surfing or sailing on the weekends. I thought they must be very rich, but they were just ordinary people working as cashiers at the local supermarket. When I found that out, I made up my mind to live in a country like this one, even if I was a janitor there. When I was traveling in Thailand, I once saw something unforgettable. It was a lovely sunny morning, and sitting outside a cafe was a Western man, drinking coffee and reading the paper in such a leisurely fashion. It looked like a scene from a movie, and I thought this was what heaven must be like. Traveling to different countries, getting up each day with a leisurely cup of coffee. In Korea, we had to work from dawn till dusk, and even if we worked our whole lives, we could barely afford to buy a home in Seoul. I became filled with dreams of living abroad. Then the company where I worked sent me to Canada for a month. As I worked in Canada, I noticed how different the working conditions there were from Korea. Just by walking into the break room, I could tell how much the Canadian company cared for its employees. The break rooms in Korean companies were humble. All they offered were tea or coffee and some small snacks. In contrast, the break room in the Canadian company was almost like a restaurant. Fresh fruits were delivered every morning, plus all kinds of beverages and snacks. There was enough food there to have a basic meal. Also, bosses and subordinates mingled freely in the office without a social gap. And the working hours were so flexible. And after work, they were free to enjoy their personal time. In Korea, just getting to work was a hellish daily battle with traffic, and we frequently worked overtime or had company dinners. Even if I got off work at a normal time, I was still so exhausted that I just watched TV or surfed the internet a little before I collapsed into bed. We were all living in the same decade, yet how could our lives be so different? I wished I hadn't been born in Korea. I wanted to enjoy life as it should be overseas and not waste it in this country. I planned my future to be able to live overseas. I was thinking about what kind of job would take me overseas, and then I decided to become an interpreter. I studied very hard for a year, investing in tutors, group studies, and going to the library every day. but I failed to get into the graduate school for interpreters. Since becoming an interpreter wasn't my ultimate goal, I didn't want to try again. So I got a job at a foreign company because I thought it would give me lots of chances to go abroad. But contrary to what I expected, there weren't many chances to go overseas. I just had a lot of work. I still used up my vacation time to travel abroad at least once a year. But the more I traveled, the thirstier I grew. As soon as I came back to Korea, I would immediately plan my next trip. Eventually, I couldn't be satisfied with just a few days in a foreign country anymore. I wanted to live overseas permanently. So, I prepared to study abroad. Usually, the reason people want to study abroad is because they actually want to study, but I didn't, and I still invested $400 a month in a study abroad prep class. The class was filled with people who had a clear goal and passion for the academics they wanted to pursue. I didn't, and I was working full time too, so I eventually ran out of energy and enthusiasm. Around that time was when I met my husband. On the very first day we met, my husband said that he was Christian and shared the gospel with me. Then he asked me if I could become his coworker in his lifelong dedication to sharing the gospel. You are seriously not my type. I wanted to marry a man who could help me live overseas like an immigrant or an international student. But my husband was working in his brother's nursing home at the time and sharing the gospel with the elderly patients there. I thought we were on two different paths and decided I wouldn't see him again. But he kept following me around and telling me the gospel. And for some reason, I didn't dislike it. Instead, I could see how sincere he was. Maybe it was an act of God, but although nothing about him was my type, I decided to marry him. Then I came to Hanmaum church with my husband, but I couldn't listen to the sermons at all. There was a verse in Romans that pricked my heart, and it was, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, but I still wanted to live my life the way I wanted. Even so, I couldn't ignore God altogether, so I prayed to accept Jesus, wrote testimonies, and sometimes I received grace during worship. But that was it. I gradually attended church less and less until I wasn't going at all. Soon after we got married, I started planning to immigrate to Australia. That was when my husband's job happened to make the top of the list of preferred immigrant jobs in Australia. I thought God was giving us this opportunity, and I began to warm my husband to the idea. But my husband was someone who had never even left the country and thought his hometown in Seoul was the center of the universe. On our honeymoon, my husband was so impressed by an airplane that he begged me to let him take the window seat. He was someone who wasn't interested in living abroad in the least. So I began to tell him stories about how wonderful living abroad was every single day. I said, "You can't even begin to compare the quality of life there to Korea. You can earn twice as much money doing the same work and live twice as more prosperously. Plus, our kids will be automatically bilingual. Imagine if you spread the gospel there, you'd be spreading the gospel on a global scale." I kept persuading my husband like this until I finally convinced him. Then we started to prepare the necessary immigration documents. We paid a consulting agency $4,000 to help us put the documents together. My husband passed the document screening, and all we had to do was pass the English test. To study English, we even moved so that we could be near the street with all the English institutes. But my husband's English skills nearly made me lose all hope. His vocabulary level was quite advanced, but he would turn into a block of ice in front of a native English speaker. He was the model example of someone who had grown up suffering the side effects of the Korean method of English education. I took care of my husband with all my heart to encourage him to study hard. And I prayed to God for him to please allow us to immigrate to Australia. I told God that if he did, I would be more faithful and share the gospel with many people overseas. Then one day my husband told me that, after thinking about it for a long time, he decided that he couldn't move to another country. I thought he was saying that because of English, but he said it was because he didn't think we should leave the church community when our faith wasn't solid yet. The day he told me that, we had the worst fight we ever had. All I could think about was how his decision was trampling on my dream. We fought so hard that we woke all of our neighbors. But my husband wouldn't change his mind. He said that we shouldn't move overseas until we were firmly standing on the gospel and sent off with the blessings of the church community. The gospel? The church community? Sent off? That night I lost all hope and collapsed into bed in complete and utter despair. The next day I was trying to make myself feel better however I could, and I took out a Christian book from the bookshelf. For some reason, I felt like I could receive some comfort from it. As I read the book, I saw how my life was so different from the life of the main character, and my heart broke. The main character of the book had met Jesus when he was a boy, and he had lived for Jesus all his life. He was harshly persecuted and tortured for his faith. His family had also suffered so much. But I didn't feel like his life was a tragedy. Rather, it was holy. I cried so much as I read that book. I realized that all this time I'd only lived for my own selfish greed. That day I told my husband that I wanted to believe in Jesus and go to church again. I found myself yearning for the passionate worship and missing the members of the church community. I realized that the church members didn't belong to this world, they belonged to heaven, and I wanted to become like them. Then I went to church again. I was giving worship with an earnest heart, and I found that I didn't feel awkward at all. I was so happy that I could call out to the Lord in prayer, and the sermon touched my heart deeply as well. And one day, one of the preachers told me the gospel. I can never forget that day. He told me a verse from John. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. I was completely surprised by this verse. No one has ever seen God? At these words, my heart began to pound loudly. If God was invisible from the beginning, no wonder I didn't really know who he was all this time. But then the verse said that the one and only who is at the Father's side has made him known. That meant that if I could figure out who this one and only was, I could meet God. This one and only was none other than Jesus. I discovered that Jesus Christ, from his birth, life, death, to his resurrection, had perfectly fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. Then I realized that Jesus was the Son of God. He was the one who was at the Father's side. This was how I personally met Jesus, who came to find us so that we could recognize the God we couldn't see. Then I read about how he had fed many people with the miracle of the 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Jesus was leaving the place of the miracle, and people were desperately searching for him. But Jesus told them, "You're looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." When I read this verse, I had to repent completely. I was the one who had been searching for God because I wanted to live a more prosperous life in this world. I hadn't really believed in him. Then God told me to believe in Jesus as my God and my Lord through the resurrection, the sign he gave for us to believe.
Amen.
The amazing thing was that after I met the risen Jesus and accepted him as the Lord of my heart, I realized that the world I was seeing and feeling right now was not everything. I couldn't see heaven, but it became real to me. My heart overflowed with a peace and joy I couldn't explain, and I couldn't possibly want anything more. I'd become someone possessing everything and lacking nothing, even though I hadn't put any effort into achieving this. The only foreign nation I longed for now was heaven, where Jesus was. I changed completely. My heart was full of only Jesus. I thought of him and nothing else. I was so moved by him every day, and I was so joyful. When my husband and I talked about God's word, love would brim over my heart. All the places I ever went to were home, work, small church meetings, and church. I was far from even visiting another country, and yet I lacked nothing. I was happy with whatever I did. I used to plan and devote everything to going abroad, but now I was devoting my life to the eternal kingdom. Heaven was all I desired. I naturally began to be with the church community in all aspects of my daily life.
Amen.
We opened the doors of our home as a place of worship. We worshipped almost every day. I also began to devote myself to praying and taking care of other souls with my church members. I'd studied English very hard so that I could live abroad, but now my English abilities were being used for translating testimonies and other resources for the church to please Jesus. Sometimes it was inconvenient for me to live like this. However, I remembered how I would dream of living abroad as I endured momentary hardships of learning English, finding a suitable job, and investing lots of money to prepare immigration documents. Then I would see heaven again. Whenever I thought about heaven, where I would meet Jesus for real, I felt so happy and hopeful that I no longer cared about my present discomfort. Plus, preparing for heaven wasn't like preparing for something of this world where you would make sacrifices in the present for something better in the future. Preparing for heaven was joy and heaven itself. If I lived abroad, I'd still be Korean. In the same way, when I became a citizen of heaven, I was living the life of a citizen of heaven, even though I was living in this tiny, stuffy land of Korea. As I lived only think about heaven this way, I found myself losing all interest in living abroad because I didn't need to desire another country in this world anymore. And I wanted to share about Jesus with whomever I met so that I could tell them about this hope we have in heaven. There was one friend who I shared the gospel with. She was the first person I shared the gospel with to believe in Jesus. She had told me that she couldn't understand how to believe because starting with Genesis, she couldn't believe in anything in the Bible. After I shared the gospel with her, we attended a small church meeting together, and that was where she came to believe in the risen Jesus as her Lord. I still can't forget the joy that filled my heart. One day, some of my friends from Australia came to visit me in Seoul. In the past, I would take my friends from abroad to Sinchon, downtown areas, and other places where you could drink and party. But on that day, I really wanted to tell them the gospel. So I took gospel tracts with me and shared the gospel simply and clearly. I said, Jesus rose again to be your Lord. Then one of my friends said, He rose again? And then she began to carefully read the gospel tract I had given her. If you were sure of the resurrection, it wasn't hard to share the gospel, even with friends from overseas. One time, my husband and I visited my grandmother in the nursing home. She was semi-conscious and unable to speak. We prayed and told her the gospel. We couldn't have a conversation with her, and she was barely conscious. So I was a bit worried about how we could tell her the gospel, but it turned out to be easy. We told her, Grandma, Jesus was raised from the dead. He rose from the dead to be your Lord. You should believe in Jesus as your Lord. If Jesus is your Lord, you can go to heaven. Then we wrote, Jesus has risen. If Jesus is your Lord, heaven, on a piece of paper to show her. I asked her, if you believe in Jesus, can you put your hand on your head? Then she did. My heart broke because I hadn't given her the gospel sooner, when she had been healthy. But I was so thankful that I could share the gospel with her even when we couldn't communicate and she was barely awake. Sharing the gospel and preparing my life for heaven was the best life ever, a life I could never find anywhere in this world. If I hadn't met Jesus, I would have spent the rest of my life wandering from one country to the next, chasing after lazy mornings with a cup of coffee. I almost wasted the one life I had on momentary pleasures in this momentary world. But Jesus allowed me to live my one and only life for the eternal kingdom, not for this temporary, momentary world.
Amen.
My risen Jesus, even at this very moment, you let me live for the eternal kingdom of heaven, not for a past that soon disappears. I love you, Lord. Thank you. If you'd like to see more stories about how the gospel changed lives, visit us at facebook.com/HMUOnlyJesus or Google us at HMUOnlyJesus.